Good evening, Samuel. Welcome to Twice Told. I'm so happy to have you here with us today.
Thanks so much. I'm happy to be here.
I'll begin by introducing you to the concept behind Twice Told. So, Twice Told is an exchange between author and reader, going beyond the reading of the book. So, the idea behind Twice Told comes from the concept of telling the book. The book was told the first time when it came into a print. Of course, you had numerous ideas of it before you thought of writing it down. Even when you were writing it, there were numerous iterations or variations. Your editor, your publicist, it finally found expression when it was printed. For me, the book was told to me the first time that I read it. I formed a series of impressions based on what I've read previously, what I've experienced in life. You have expressed this through your point of view as well. But now that author and reader are sitting across each other and revisiting this book, the book truly comes twice told. I hope that we revisit by this visit again, we touch upon areas which you may not have initially thought of, or you're now seeing in a new light. I hope that this comes out through this conversation.
Great. Yeah, sounds good.
So, my first question is going to be about this book. Why did you choose to write about progress?
Well, I suppose several things led to writing about progress in this way and approaching it from this angle. I'd say the first was, I come from a kind of activist household. My parents have been very involved in a lot of different movements in the U.S. I'm from Michigan, so they would go from Michigan to Washington D.C. and do protests, things like women's rights and environment, and these kinds of justice, economic justice issues, and so was sort of raised inside that kind of mindset, and really inculcated with this belief that progress is not only possible, it's the kind of central aim, or should be the central aim of life of most people. Of you're born, you live, you want to make the world a better place, and then pass on something better to your children and their children. And so that it was kind of this, maybe a kind of secular belief system, secular religion sort of thing that I was raised within. And it's really been a motivator for pretty much everything I've done, including going into the academy and scholarship, and really believing in progress in knowledge, and being able to contribute to compounding knowledge. And I think I sort of first started to interrogate the idea a little bit in maybe 2018, 19, and started getting interested in the idea of development. This is a word that we kind of take for granted as this neutral or positive thing. We want to develop. We want to develop land. We want people to be developed. More developed countries, this kind of thing. And I just started to kind of interrogate that concept and, going through the etymological history of the word and the kind of intellectual lineage of the concept. And then that, of course, led to this sort of bigger, more maybe romantic concept of progress, which has become, synonymous with development and growth and that whole sort of, complex of ideas. And so it was just this kind of process of interrogating this idea that I sort of took for granted, that I think a lot of us take for granted, and wanting to understand better the history of the idea and how it has impacted societies and economies through time, and how we got to this point where we have this idea of infinite growth, infinite economic expansion, as being the kind of sole goal of everything, of every institution, every company, every country, uh, simultaneously with this, these very clear kinds of limits to growth, in the form of, atmospheric warming and deforestation these kinds of ecological crises. And so progress became a kind of vehicle for understanding these more material, more abstract kind of processes that have led to, growth being predominant, and kind of served as a way of understanding a particular kind of political economy that emerges in Mesopotamia, and develops through these different periods through time. And progress was a sort of proxy for seeing how that kind of political economy has changed. And it kind of progress is like a window, we might say, into the culture, whereas the kind of more material study that the book is also doing is something that transcends culture. It's a process that we see across all these different geographies, all these different time periods. But progress is something that is more culturally inflected. It's something, I can go into archives, I can go into letters, I can go into the intellectual output of these cultures, and it's a kind of it's a way to trace that historical development with something that's a little more, I don't know, maybe interesting, a little more kind of relevant to sort of daily life, relevant to kind of our understanding of the world and history, and then, as I say, my own kind of motivation.
Understood. Now, given the kind of progress that we have seen being played out across the world, and this definition of progress that we have come to accept, although it's not palatable, because it is progress for some, regress for most. So, what, according to you, is a humane definition of progress? One that is equitable and equitable for everybody and encompasses all in its scope for growth.
So it's a very good question, and a really big kind of question at the heart of the book. It's something I take most of the book to try to kind of get to toward the end. I think I start to put forward a definition of that, of what a kind of alternative narrative of progress and improvement might look like. I think you kind of have to start answering that question with what isn't progress, but is often considered progress. And so for instance, I think any kind of change, any kind of societal economic process that reduces biodiversity, reduces human beings' autonomy, or creates a situation where the habitability of the planet itself is jeopardized. Anything that does that, I think, just cannot be called progress, no matter what it is, and no matter what other benefits it might have. So there are a lot of technological examples of that. I've just recently written about AI as a kind of it's a performance of progress, but it's not the real thing because it's doing those negative things that I mentioned. It's contributing to carbon emissions. It you know, contribute to pollution in the neighborhoods where data centers are built. It's stealing water, it's stealing intellectual property. It's doing all of these negative things that I just think if you're doing any of that, it's not progress. It can't be in a kind of a definition of progress that is reasonable and scientifically informed. So what I get to toward the end of the book is a sort of a mix of things that I am careful not to put into a sort of single, ideology or a single system, really kind of wanting to avoid uh, the sort of hegemonic program that's the answer to all problems. And but I try to put forward some particular strategies and particular changes that I think would be, pointing us in a better direction than we're going now. And so these things are like keep it in the ground style policy with regard to fossil fuels, just cutting off supply and mitigating demand in a way that I think you're sort of capping luxury emissions, things like private jets and AI and things like this, and looking at how you redesign urban space and rural space and how those two things uh, interrelate to one another. So the urban redesign is things like implementing wildlife zones, being able to kind of expand these areas where other species are able to find a home and exist and coexist alongside human civilization. On the rural side of things, I think that means expanding agroecological programs, kind of breaking up some of these big expansive farms and integrating agriculture more with ecological zones and health. And and then there's a lot of kind of domestic, internal, inside the country, inside the human system, not just the human environment relation. And this is things like bringing up UBIs and wealth taxes and things that are redistributive in the kind of uh, you know in the issue of inequality and kind of breaking up these hoarded fortunes and um, the if I kind of wanted to put a umbrella term on that, what I'm sort of framing that as is a commensalistic or mutualistic kind of relationship, uh, both between human systems and environmental systems, as well as between classes, human groups within human systems. So commensalism being this kind of relationship where you have extraction or mutual extraction happening that is not harmful. So you're still having a kind of labor expenditure within an economy, but one that isn't parasitic, doesn't involve a small class extracting labor from these large populations, and then in the human system, environmental system relation, that's not causing collapses essentially. So you may still have extractive industries, you may still have some kind of, I mean, that's a reality of being a species on the planet is you have to have a kind of energy extraction taking place between organisms, but figuring out a way to do that that's not actually collapsing populations. And what I start the book with and end the book with is this argument that that's the natural way to be humans, is to be able to conduct that extraction without collapsing populations. It's something that human groups have done for 300,000 years, uh, and it's something we're going to have to figure out how to do again. And I'm sort of framing this 5,000 year period as an aberration. It's something that's a real kind of diversion from human nature, not a culmination of it or a kind of expression of it. And so, to me, a humane definition of progress is something that's more aligned with that kind of commensalistic, mutualistic form of relations.
Understood. I love the way that you've described commensalism and commensalistic practices within the first few pages of the book. That was an idea that blew me away. While, yes, we speak about it, but not quite in disjointed terms, that we say people have lived in relative equality with nature. There have been symbiotic relationships. Or when we speak about indigenous people, we look at them from this nostalgic point of view that there existed this life. But you have quantified that and said this is possible. Now, my next question is going to be about colonialism. Given that it is inherently parasitic to its host country, its host resources and people, I say parasitic because it reduces the host country into merely resource. People, natural resources. I mean, the term natural resources being used because there's no other objective word that I can use. But all of these being reduced to mere objects and numbers. Why and how is it that this practice, given that commensalistic practices existed in the world, how is it that this particular variant found acceptance, and not just acceptance, but hurrah and cheers as well?
So the uh, it's a good question that I kind of try to get at pretty early on in the book, and I follow David Wengrow, archaeologist, British archaeologist, in this. In he has a great short book about the early dynastic period in Mesopotamia, and he's arguing that this not quite 5,000 years ago is where you see the first kind of colonial empires. You see the first examples of states that create colonies and create kind of market networks between those colonies. And I think you also see the written record, you know, I think is compatible with that reading. And so I'm starting with Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh, as a kind of a narrative that reveals some of the attitudes of the time. So that region had been populated for thousands of years before this 5,000 year mark, the early dynastic period. And during those thousands of years, it was largely forested. You had, extensive cedar forests and all sorts of mature growth forests. And the fact that you had agricultural states and that forest coexisting for so many millennia, to me, that suggests that there was probably some kind of sustainable forestry. There was some kind of, a deliberate sort of engagement with that forest resource that wasn't rapidly depletive, especially when you look at how forest resources on the North American continent were depleted in decades. It's clear human groups can deforest very very quickly, even without fossil fuels, even without these kinds of tools. So if you have this evidence of forest existing for thousands of years in this period alongside states, it's not just it's not just a state formation that's decimating them. When you have this deforestation occurring a little more than 5,000 years ago, I think you can see an attitude shift in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a myth that is essentially glorifying the destruction of the forest. That's the central motif of it, and the kind of process of civilization of the people and the environment in the area. And so what I'm arguing in the book is I'm kind of marking that as the pivotal cultural moment where these kinds of societies break from that commensalistic past. It's not just that they are physically being more depletive, it's also that they have a culture that celebrates that depletion and sees it as not just necessary but glorious and good. And of course, that's an attitude that doesn't stay in Mesopotamia or with Assyria or that kind of those kinds of market empire city states, but spreads. And you see that attitude of sort of celebrating conquest and depletion as being ubiquitous. It starts to appear in all of these other cultures and empires. And I think the important part of that as well is it's not just a break from having a kind of more commensalistic attitude toward forests or you know wild animals or the environment, but also between people within those kinds of societies. And what you see with the rise of these market empires is the rise of forced labor, the rise of conscripted militaries, and large systematic warfare. War becomes not just a kind of territorial squabble or a kind of cultural antagonism. It becomes this systematic, almost kind of business campaign of going and taking land to bring into the market metabolism. Um, and I think that's an important change that happens around this time period as well. So if I was going to kind of pinpoint that moment where societies break from this commensalistic belief system, and I also start the book talking about animism quite a lot, and that there is an actual kind of theology that is involved in that material process of commensalism. Um, People really break from that in this early dynastic period.
Understood. Now, in my conversations with another historian, he did mention that Assyria was perhaps the world's first super militaristic, super violent empire, and it started off with an explosion and went up similarly in flames as well. And Assyria, because of its violent nature, influenced its neighbors, and upon its collapse, it was because these neighbors eventually turned upon it and tore it apart. Now, do you think that in this process somewhere we have forgot, humans as a whole, have we forgotten how to be commensalistic?
Well, I, I also start pretty early on talking about uh, the evidence we have, I think, right now is that human beings, if there's a human nature or human natures, uh, human beings tend to be fairly pro-social, tend to have this capacity for uh, compassion and, even kind of selfless altruism very expansively that can include other species, can include plants and animals, even inanimate objects. Um, and this has likely been a part of human psychology since before humans existed, since the nearest ancestors, evolutionary ancestors. And I don't think that instinct has left. I don't, I can't say this with total confidence, but I don't think there's been enough generations to have created a totally anatomically different human being today from these periods of commensalism and animism. Um, so I'd like to think that uh, we still have that, and I think you do see a lot of examples of that. I think there are many people, probably a plurality or a majority of people, who really believe in uh, helping wildlife thrive, helping people have more free and fair and thriving lives outside of what they might consider their in-group. Um, but I think what progress ideology does so effectively, and the kind of ideology that fall under that umbrella, is co-opt that pro-sociality and turn it toward very destructive and depletive ends. And I think you see this over and over, and the book goes through a lot of examples of this, where that kind of cooperativeness, that natural desire to work together, gets turned toward things like war and conquest and genocide and slavery. And I think that's something that unfortunately is still being very effectively hijacked and put toward these disgusting kind of actions and ends. And you still see this in U.S. imperialism and all over the place. And so I think there's still this real kind of war within human populations between this real pro-social kind of instinct and this social structure and system that compels people to do these things that are so antisocial and so harmful. And so, I think that's something that uh, I don't know. I don't see a clear way to mitigate against those kinds of social structures that are so effective at hijacking, doing this kind of social engineering. And it's been compounding. I think these kinds of systems have gotten better over time at manipulating people and hijacking that kind of positive psychology, and develop all these tools to do it. You know, Silicon Valley is a factory for producing these kinds of tools of hijacking people's brains, and so I think it's a harder battle now. I it's also just want to bring up that's an interesting example you mentioned about Assyria's neighbors hastening its collapse. Um, I think that is a phenomenon that you have seen a lot in the North American continent as well, where when you have these kinds of upstart societies that try to expand and conquer their neighbors often don't respond positively to that, and fight back. And I think that's when that's where a lot of the effective resistance to these kinds of societies have come from, is from outside, is from these other cultures that are trying to stop the expansion, without necessarily themselves doing the same thing, expanding and doing conquest and so forth. So, I think if we can see more examples of societies like that are practicing something like mutualism or commensalism, able to stand up against these kinds of expansive conquest-oriented states, I think that would be a source of some optimism.
Understood. I would have expected religion to be a form of optimism or expected to guide us toward some higher form of wisdom. However, in especially in today's time and context, I'm seeing that religion has been weaponized. It's used more as a coping mechanism, one, for the in-group, and as a weapon toward anyone who's not a part of that in-group. Anyone who's not in that circle becomes an enemy, and now religion is used as a weapon of discrimination, and you're given an incentive, not just material incentive, now you have divine appointment. And this has been happening since the time of the Crusades. Call it any other form of holy war. This is what we're seeing playing out. So, how is it that we can stop this collective trauma that started from Assyria? How do we put a stop to it? Because, as you've explained, I'm starting to see patterns of perhaps this is unreconciled trauma that we're just playing out over and over again.
Yeah, it's a difficult question that I think I don't have a clear answer uh, in the book. It, I think it is definitely. I mean, part of the issue is, as you're saying, intervening in this kind of cycle, um, and doing so in a large scale, decisive kind of way, kind sort of in an interruptive process, I guess. And the difficulty today, I think, is that we have this globe spanning network. It's so big and it's so resilient to internal changes. I don't know if it's necessarily resilient to external forces and things like, atmospheric destabilization and, climate destabilization and all of that. But it does seem resilient to internal changes and shocks. Um, and so I think, part of that strategy has to include finding points where you can kind of insert alternatives and, kind of force uh, openings for alternative systems, alternative ideologies and ways of organizing societies and economies. And, to me, it's not very clear right now what those are. I think, in my time in kind of different forms of activism, I've been confronted with a lot of things that looked like that, looked like, openings that you can kind of intervene in, but turned out to maybe not be that. And so, for example, for a while, I was working on sustainable agriculture in the private sector and, working on farms, working on a startup that was kind of pitched as a way of disrupting these large agricultural supply chains, disrupting the heavy fertilizer pollution and pesticide load that agriculture requires today, and found a lot of obstacles to that, and found that it actually wasn't necessarily a good avenue for kind of interrupting this process. And it's kind of, I think my experience has been a just a series of that, really, in activism of kind of, another example would be looking at community renewable projects. That was part of my DPhil thesis, and going around and looking at how different communities have self-organized alternative energy systems. And it's very positive. It's nice to see that, but I haven't seen examples of that really kind of intervening in a scalable way, or intervening in a way that spreads to a lot of other places and becomes a kind of alternative. It's always a supplement. It's always something that adds on to this resilient system, never something that changes it or interrupts the process of it. Um, so I think we're still kind of waiting on that thing, looking for that thing, trying to invent that, which can really insert itself into this global network and replicate to the point where it produces something else. Um, and I wish I could point to something that was very clearly doing that, but um, I don't think it's impossible to imagine that or to do that. But it does seem like the system is very well designed to prevent it. And one of the later chapters in the book looks at the history of and current uh, situation of security systems, intelligence services, these kinds of things, how these have been ubiquitous throughout empires, throughout history, across the world. Every empire seems to have its own CIA or intelligence service. And today, that apparatus is bigger than it's ever been. It covers more miles, it covers more people, has more technology than it's ever had. And it kind of stands as this, wall against inserting these kinds of alternatives. And I think this is something that is difficult for us sometimes in these, radical or change-oriented spaces to really confront, is that there is this weaponized, heavily armed, ruthless kind of thing that exists to prevent changes from happening. And but then on the other side of that, I think these security services also exaggerate their power and their competence. And I think even in those, you can find holes, you can find spaces to insert and prise open. I think they are vulnerable as well, and really, I think maybe getting back a little bit to what you're saying at the beginning, there is in most people, certainly not all people, but in most people, there is that kind of pro-social core that I think wants to be generous and compassionate and altruistic.
Understood. Now, speaking about the same, expanding on the same vein, that I did realize reading your book, ideology has played an important part in parasitic empires expanding and sustaining their methodology. That people had to be told this over and over again, be it the Monroe Doctrine or any other imperialist term that we may use. Is it possible we could use the same concept to promote commensalism? Of course, we don't have that industrial might which these commercial gigantic empires now have. But is it possible that we could somewhere, somehow appeal to the commensalistic spirit in individuals and communities and hope for them to opt for, if not outright reject, this parasitic existence?
I think it's a very good question, and I think still an open question. Um, I would say, the way I try to frame ideologies and ideological systems in the book is as these sort of secularized faiths. A kind of they're doing a similar thing that religions, classical traditional religions, are doing. They're just taking some of the myth out of it, some of the magic out of it, I guess. The disenchanting or de-enchanting the kind of the religion, and they have ethical tenets. You go through any of these ideologies, Marxism, liberalism, fascism, they have very defined ethical tenets. They have cosmologies, these myths about how the world starts and where it goes and why it goes that way and why it works as it does. And I think these kinds of frameworks probably are important for people to be able to understand the world, something as complex and chaotic and kind of messy and plastic as the world, and then to act upon the world. I think these kinds of frameworks, these sort of shared understanding of how things work and why they work and how they should work, are probably just necessary. As much as I would like to say all orthodoxy is bad and harmful, and we should all try to avoid, adhering too much to any of these faiths or orthodoxies. They do, I think, still have a use in this kind of big global networked system where you have so many people across so many different cultures, classes, and and geographies having to kind of work together, talk to each other, have shared terminology, shared goals. And I do think, ideological programs to some extent can provide those things. And like I say, I don't know if there's any fully formed program I could point to and say this is doing commensalism, or this is a mutualistic ideology that's commensurate with the size of the challenges, the scale of the problems, and all of that. I think there are a lot of nascent ones that have potential. There's the kind of in the degrowth, spectrum of ideas, and eco-socialism and eco-anarchism. All of this. I think there are a lot of these sort of small burgeoning kinds of ideological communities, but they don't seem to me at the moment commensurate with shifting this massive network of supply chains and corporations and states and militaries. And so, and in some ways, I think the scale of everything of these, states, these human systems, is in some ways incompatible with a commensalistic and a kind of mutualistic relation. And it may simply be the case that you can't have these massive states and economies that aren't parasitic to some degree. I don't know. I don't want to say that as definitively, because I don't know that that's true, but it may be a thing, and I know there've been a lot of scholars of degrowth and or kind of growth critical scholars, I guess, over the last 50 years, who have pointed to scale as the critical factor here, and saying that you just have to have smaller things, smaller states, smaller corporations, companies, economies, and that ultimately you can't really achieve these things without that kind of scaling down. But I think, through that process of scaling down, of deciding that's something that is good and should be done, I do think there is a place for kind of systematized frameworks for ethical tenets and all of this. And it doesn't necessarily have to be secular entirely. I mean, as I point to in the beginning, animism, I think, has been a kind of belief system that is very effective at combining a an empirical understanding of the world, having a very rigorous scientific understanding of the physical reality, combining that with having this kind of divinity that's focused on biocentrism, on the the value of other species, the value of the integrity of ecological systems, and that that's not a secular system. That it does have this kind of enchantment to it and this kind of religiosity to it, that I think can be very valuable. I think it's just that the religious systems, to a large extent, that we have today are so easy to co-opt for goals of conquest and goals of subjugation, and, as you say, attacking outgroups and ensuring that people in the in-group act in a certain way and conform. And so, as I see this kind of resurgence of like Christian socialism, for instance, I'm always a bit wary of that because I think it's something that can be and has been in some cases an effective tool for expanding, emancipatory politics. But it also is very easy to co-opt and to turn toward social control.
I love the fact that you hit upon a nerve, that is disenchantment. Disenchantment is extremely important in my opinion, and what I've understood across in the play of history is that whenever there have been moments of disenchantment, be it the culmination of the French Revolution or before that, what resulted in the culmination of the Magna Carta, or following the French Revolution, the Revolution of 1815, and what led to eventually the development of socialism, the disenchantment following the fall of socialism. This is an important point or epoch for us to sit back, think collectively, what is it that we've done wrong, and how can we course correct from here for in a way that maximizes progress. And R- speaking about the form of progress that we discussed about in the first question, one which is equitable for everybody. That's extremely important at this point in time. So, how is it that we make people take heed and pay attention to this, given that we are in a time of disenchantment right now? And I'm saying this is a period of disenchantment again because world over, be it the United States or anywhere else, we are going back to predatory mechanisms that existed about 100, 150 years ago of imperialism and conquest, not just arbitrary or in by way of corporate acquisitions, but naked aggression. For me, this seems to be hinting at disenchantment. Okay, we tried something, it didn't work. Let's go back to smash and grab.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right that so much of the it's a kind of nihilism, that's kind of just absurd. Everything's a joke, nothing matters, all that matters is accumulating wealth for yourself and or whatever institution you represent. And everything's a big joke and we're all going to die or whatever. I think that's that is definitely, it does seem like the kind of the zeitgeist at the moment. And I think you're right, also connecting it to a kind of Gilded Age, predatory attitude among corporations and states and individuals. and I think the question of reenchantment is a very important one, and something that I mean it's also something that I would put a caveat on with the religiosity, is that you can also have a kind of dark reenchantment, that I think you see like with like Nazi Germany has this kind of mysticism. They're using the occult, and they're using these sort of, they're very exuberant, they're very optimistic. There's a real kind of triumphal sort of mysticism in Nazi Germany, and I think it's possible for the enemies of fairness and equity and freedom and all of these things to use religiosity and a kind of enchantment for very evil purposes. But I don't think that means that we need to let them have it, that we need to leave that as a tool for those people. I think it is something that's very important to nurture and try to reinvest in the culture. And I don't, again, I don't have a very clean, neat answer for that. I think for one thing, it's kind of a finding the finding meaning, finding a sense of purpose, and finding something like that to hold on to in the wild and wilderness, in other life, in the kind of sacredness of forests and intact ecological systems. Ecological systems are not just services for the economy. They're not just resources. They're not things that are just there to be used by humans. They are things that exist for their own sake. They have intrinsic value. They're things that should be allowed to live simply because they're beautiful and because they have their own way of living in the world. And I think there's a lot of potential for that kind of attitude, belief, to form a framework for reenchanting, and for reinvigorating some of these kinds of resistance, or alternative, change-oriented kind of communities. I don't think it's the only one, but I think it's an important one. And and as you say as well, ensuring that whatever change happens is equitable and is something that is not systematically, oppressing or depriving a whole population of people, is very important. And I think that's connected with this kind of environmental ethic. The argument I make in the book is that when you have a kind of parasitism that is oriented to the environment, it will it will be applied to people within that society as well, between classes within it. That's just a relationship that seems to exist through cultures, through time. So if you have, by contrast, a commensalistic kind of relationship between a human system and environment, you can probably be sure that the internal relations within that human system will also be commensalistic and mutualistic. And I don't know which comes first. I don't know if there's a kind of linear causality to that. But I think, starting with that kind of environmental ethic, I think can be very powerful. And, kind of treating the rest of the natural world as a sort of part of the human world. These are, the pigeons are the proletariat as well. They're also part of the kind of the class system of this economy, and seeing them as, as natural kind of cohabitants of that resistance movement. And um, I think a lot of the communities that I've been involved with, or kind of been engaging with, I think they often look to past examples of that kind of enchantment you're talking about, as a way of reinvigorating present movements. And I think that's good and fine. And, you know, and I wouldn't want to discourage that, but I think there's a limit to that as well, and a limit to what that can provide. And I think it is something that we have to be forging anew. You know, we have to be creating that based on something new, something that's of this time, if it's going to change this time. And and so and I leave it in the book as I think I end a chapter saying this is something that we might just have to get together and coax, coax out of a huddle, and that it's not something that currently exists, but has to be created.
I agree with you. Change at this level, a systemic level, which requires unlearning, say, 5,000 years of repetitive behavior, may not even happen in our lifetimes, may not even happen in our immediate descendants' lifetimes, but perhaps a second, a third, a fourth generation. But it's important that we start chipping away toward it. And I like the fact that you mentioned you don't have a clear answer, but answers are not as important as the fact that we ask these questions. A later generation may somewhere somehow discover a clear, concise answer toward it. So let's keep at it of asking this effort of asking questions and creating an environment or situation where people feel uncomfortable with how things are playing out, as opposed to this opiated dead society where consumerism keeps our senses numb and dull. Instead, we try to force people to reconcile with material reality, what's happening, climate change, breakdown of communities, and envisioning a possible future, one which is more equitable to all. And as you mentioned, with mysticism, and this is exactly in line with Alain Badiou's being an event. So the event could flow in either direction, one toward a mysticism where you have an in-group versus an out-group, or perhaps a more vague and yet all-encompassing everyone is family kind of a in-group phenomena. That being said, do you envision a different ending for this book? Would you have thought of writing this book in a different way in light of these in light of this discussion?
I think because it is it just that's very well said. By the way, I agree with everything you just said. I appreciate that. And Yeah, because so the book is spanning 5,000 years and all these different cultures. It is very focused on Western history, and a major reason for that is just that it's what I could access, given my tools and resources, and because a book has a limit to how many pages you can include, and so I did have to limit the scope of the book. I would have liked to incorporate more from more Asian sources, more maybe South American examples, more African examples, and I think it would have been interesting, I guess, to incorporate more of that and see how that sort of compares with this Western course of development, and how different narratives become progressive or not in those examples, and whether you see kind of similar sorts of social organization happening without progress narratives, and or just what shape they might take. They might, take very different forms. Um, so I think I would have wanted to open up the scope a little bit there. Um, I wish I could say that I would have ended it a little more optimistically. I think it is fairly optimistic. And I don't know if I feel more optimistic now than I did when I wrote it. But I think it's I think there would have been a lot of different ways to organize it as well. Uh, it's really organized around these kinds of inflection points and periods where dominant progress narratives shift, where they become more secular, where they become more focused on uh, economics and ideologies and things, and so I think there would have been some different ways of organizing it that might have been interesting, might have been a bit more narrative or something, but it went through several iterations, and this was the one that kind of made logical sense at the time, and hopefully is something that makes sense as people are reading it. But I think progress. It's such a big and important story. I think there are a lot of ways to approach it, and I hope there are more different approaches to this issue and kind of interrogations of the issue. And I think there'd be a lot of ways to do that, and a lot of ways to formulate answers to these great questions around how do we get something else? How do we move on to a more kind of equitable and biodiverse definition of progress? And I think it's a big question that is waiting for a lot of answers.
I would hope that this book materializes in an activism in a form or various forms of activism, be it grassroots or perhaps at a more abstract level, and aim toward creating a sense of consciousness toward other life forms and accept that they also have agency just as much as humans do and they have a right to exist. Progress has been a fantastic book. I enjoyed reading it to the hilt, and
Thank you.
it has spurred me to now acquire so many more books that you've mentioned in your bibliography. And thank you for authoring this book. You have
Thank you.
truly put me on a path toward enlightenment, and hopefully, this changes my perspective toward consumerism and in my life, if not my immediate surroundings.
Thanks very
Thank you
much,
once
Robin.
again.
I appreciate that very much.
Thank you, Samuel. This was a fantastic conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, great questions. I appreciate that. I'm sorry we didn't get to. You had a lot of great questions on there. That would have been fun as well. But yeah, I think that was very good. We covered a lot.
Given the limitations of time and effort, and just as much as the way it is with your book as well, there's only so much ground you could possibly cover within the confines of a physical book. Otherwise, this would become a doctrine by itself.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Thanks again, Samuel.
Thank you, Pravin. Yeah, keep in touch.
Talk to you soon. Thank you. Take
Great.
care.
You too.
Bye bye.
Bye.